Hey there, Willowbrook, and thanks so much for doing our daily Devo with us today. We are in Exodus chapter 7. We're going to start our passage in verse 14, but what we're doing is we're continuing the story of Moses and God's promise and direction to Moses that God is going to deliver his people from Egypt. They've been slaves in Egypt, and he's told Moses, hey, I'm going to deliver my people, and you're the guy I'm going to use. A couple weeks ago, Jared actually preached on the passage where Moses comes back with all of his fears, all of his excuses, all the reasons this is not a good idea. And every time God said, I will be with you. But the reality is we're to the place where Moses has gone to the Pharaoh of Egypt, and all of his fears that he expressed to God are actually being realized. The very things that he said are actually happening, and you have to think, did he want to go? I told you, God. I told you this is what he would do. And God said, hey, never said he wouldn't. I'm telling you that I'll be with you. I've thought about this a lot in the last few days. I've thought about this passage that we're reading today. I've thought about it in terms of my life and your life and the things that God has called you and I to do. Some of them are very specific to the things that God has assigned you to carry out, the very specific things God has assigned me to carry out. And sometimes I think that we think that the calling of God means that we're somehow going to just be teleported from where we are into the ease of carrying out his calling. Well, clearly we find from the Old Testament story here that even though God had promised deliverance, it was going to get harder before it got easier. And sometimes that's true for you and I. God has called us to something, and our yes is not a yes to ease. It's not a yes that everything's going to be sunshine and rainbows. It's a yes to believe that God will be with us. It's a yes for our part in what some scholars would call the upper story. God is writing a story that is far above us, and we're just saying, yes, God, I will participate in what you are doing, knowing that there's probably going to be resistance. There's probably going to be things that are really challenging about that. And when we get to verse 14, we find the very first of the real resistance and hardship that God is putting on the Egyptians to say. And in fact, he says this, he says, so that they will know that I am God. So that they will know that I am God. And so when we get to verse 14, we find the first plague is the plague of blood. And what happens is that God turns the Nile River in Egypt into blood. Well, that's significant for several reasons. One, the Nile River was the very life of Egypt. Without the Nile River, it's just a big desert. But the Nile River provided life. It provided what they needed to grow crops, what they needed to drink, to bathe, all of those things. It all centered around the Nile River. They needed the Nile River. It was also significant because the Nile River was central to their deity system, Egyptian deity system. And so they had beliefs about the different gods that lived in the Nile or that reigned over the Nile, or one of them that they believed that it was actually the very bloodstream of the god. And that was even before the Nile was blood. So it was very significant that the Nile River would be this target. It's also significant that it turned to blood because the Nile River was the place in which these Israelite babies, boys, were murdered. In the Nile River, there was literally blood on the hands of Egyptians, and God is turning the Nile into blood, and he says, I'm doing this so that they will know that I am God. Those deities that they think live here, I am God. Now, let's keep in mind here, though, that there is a lower story that's happening. There's an upper story that God's writing, that they would know that he is God, but there's a lower story that's happening with Moses and Aaron and the Egyptians and Pharaoh and all of these people And all along, Moses and Aaron are simply joining God in participation of what he's doing. But you know that they had to have a lot of questions like, this is probably not going to turn out well. Pharaoh's going to be mad. What's the next step? All the questions. And I think that's the question for you and I. Are you walking through a lower story that it's really, really hard to even imagine what God might be doing? Could God be doing something that has very little to do with you, but he wants to show someone that he is God? There's people who are far from God. They don't have a relationship with him. They are enemies of God. Does God want to show them that he is God? And our eyes see things that just look bad and evil and plague-like. As we go through these plagues, I think it's important that we remember that part of the upper story is God delivering his people, keeping his promise, but also God making sure that everyone, the Egyptians, particularly these enemies of God, might know that he is the one true God. Do you know that in your heart today? You may know that on an academic or an intellectual level, but does your heart know and trust? And are you willing to participate in what God is doing, even if it looks messy, even if it looks scary, even if the next step is what ifs? God is there, he is present, he is the one true God. And you can participate in what he's doing as you trust him and as you give him your yes, even as you question or you're just not sure. You believe that we serve a good God who delivers and loves us. Oh, Willowbrook, I love you, and I hope that you'll have a happy Wednesday.